Welcome to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward. Our guest this week is Kent Monkman. Monkman is a Canadian visual and performance artist of Cree ancestry who uses a variety of mediums, including paintings that you can see here, film and video, performance and installation. He also has had numerous solo exhibitions around the country. One of his most recent works is Shame and Prejudice, a story of resilience, which is touring around the country now. Kent, thank you so much for welcoming us to your studio here in Toronto.
It's great to have you. Welcome.
I guess I'd like to start with when you first discovered your passion for the arts.
I was a kid. I mean, I've been an artist my entire life. Probably from the age of 4, I identified as an artist, and I was encouraged by my family, so my artistic identity was really shaped very early in life. It was really more just a question as I, got to high school age, like what path am I going to take to get training, and how does one become a professional artist? That was really more the question. But I, from my earliest memories, I was drawing and painting, so it was an easy choice for me, and I was fortunate that I was encouraged to do that.
How difficult was the journey, I guess, from a 4-year-old drawing to where you are today?
Well, of course, it didn't really become difficult until I decided to become a professional artist, because then you realize that the obstacles that lay ahead of you are many, and you have to find your own path. You have to chart a new course, really. If you're going to be an artist and set yourself apart from others who've gone before you, you have to do something different, and you have to find your own way of making a mark. And you have to find your own voice, and that was the challenging part in terms of a personal journey, was what do I want to say and how do I want to say it? And that takes many years, and for many years I painted and I pushed paint around. I call it pushing paint around because I was just learning what paint could do, and was exploring different themes and subjects, but I didn't really come to a more mature vision up until maybe 15 years ago. So there was a long period of trial and error and exploration with the medium itself before I kind of figured out exactly what I wanted to say and how I was going to do it.
When did you first realize that, this is something that I'm going to be able to do as a career for my life?
I think I was in high school, and I had a really encouraging, art teacher and drafting teacher in where I went to school at Calvin High in Winnipeg, and they encouraged me. And my brother was a year ahead of me, and he was a very good artist, and he went to college a year ahead of me, so I kind of followed in his footsteps. But it was really at the high school age, where I kind of really decided that I was going to choose a career.
As you mentioned, you grew up in Winnipeg. What did that play into the career and the work that you do, your upbringing in Manitoba?
Well, my perspective as a person has really, it's shaped by my Indigenous background, and my perspective that I bring to my work now really is about bringing an Indigenous point of view to my work. So I feel like some of the experiences, the things that affected me and shaped me as a human being were part of that growing up in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg, as we know, is a high Indigenous population. And some of these things I'm able to talk about now with some distance and perspective on that experience. And for instance, I grew up going to the Manitoba Museum as a kid and going on school trips there and seeing dioramas in the museum that represent Indigenous people kind of frozen in time in this perfect pre-contact state. And then I would step outside onto Main Street and you'd see Indigenous people, stumbling out of bars on Main Street. So I remember as a kid just trying to come to terms with that difference between, how museums represented Indigenous people and the reality of Indigenous people, in the city of Winnipeg and other cities in Canada too. So as an adult, I've been able to kind of process all of that, and this exhibition, Shame and Prejudice, really has brought that experience, my own experience, into a kind of clarity with the different chapters that I'm exploring through that exhibition.
Maybe when we're talking about dioramas, we can discuss the nativity scene of yours and the difference between what you're seeing in the Manitoba Museum and that piece of work.
So yeah, As a professional artist, I started to work with the idiom of the diorama because a lot of my work challenges work that was made by settler artists in the 19th century, and then the museum practices that perpetuate a lot of these subjective ideas about Indigenous people that are really from a European point of view. So the diorama and museum cultures are really part of that. So I started to make dioramas that would twist and surprise people with the content. So they would have some of the same elements, a life-size, taxidermy, an animal, or a life-size human figure, but they would be telling a different perspective on Indigenous people. So I would set one in an urban environment. I would play with time, so I found that the diorama has been really useful as a counterpart to the paintings, and a lot of the narratives are kind of similar.
So maybe we can talk a little about Shame and Prejudice, and it's garnered a lot of attention. I understand it took a lot of work, obviously, and research. Maybe a little on what went into that.
So I was approached by Barbara Fisher, the gallery director at the University of Toronto Art Museum, about 3 years ago, and she wanted to do a response exhibition to Canada 150, because we know there's going to be celebrations about Canada 150. And I jumped at the opportunity because here is a moment where I could reflect on what are the last 150 years specifically meant to Indigenous people. And that last 150 years really runs concurrently with the period of modernity. It also runs concurrently almost with the signing of the Western treaties, the beginning of the reserve system here in Canada, the beginning of the legacy of incarceration of Indigenous people, the beginning of the residential school system, on and on and on, the institutionalization of Indigenous people that continues to this day. So here was a moment in time to really focus on revisiting this very harsh period of history, and to bring to lens it through my own artistic vision.
Some people would think it's provocative. What's been the reaction to it?
Well, I've really been surprised and overwhelmed, but largely positive response, because I think one of the main components of this exhibition was to create history paintings of some of these specific moments in history that have never been painted before, at least in the canon of Western art history. So I'm using, elements from classical painting and talking about Indigenous histories. So people have really responded, for instance, to the painting of the removal of children for residential schools. I was trying to find a way to talk about residential schools in the telling of this in this exhibition, and I decided to focus on that moment when the children were being taken away from their parents and their families. So that is one painting that really resonated with the audience, and we posted it on Facebook, and it went viral. Within a few days, it had gone up to 300,000 views. So this was something that was unexpected, and has been really very gratifying in terms of how people have responded to the work.
We're kind of talking about the Scream, I guess, right now, and it's something that created quite a reaction for myself, some of the stories that I've told over the years as well. And it's a theme that you visit in other works too, the RCMP and the church. Can you talk about why that's a theme that you'd like to use?
Well, this is such an important part of the last 150 years. You can't really talk about the last 150 years unless you actually bring the residential schools into this conversation. So the impact has been, vast, and it's been multi-generational. Almost every Indigenous family has been affected by residential schools. So I felt like it was really almost central to the telling of this story that I wanted to tell. The TRC has really shed light on the breadth and the layers of damage, in our communities. So, I was reading part of the TRC, and it talked about how the Indian agent and the Mounties or a nun or a priest would come, and so I wanted to create a visual image that really just kind of captured what that moment must have been like.
We're just going to have to take a quick break. We're here with artist Kent Monkman on FaceToFace, and we'll be back with more.
If a story is uncomfortable, would you change it? No, you wouldn't, because there's no power in holding back. Stories have the power to change lives, so true storytellers uncover every side of hunger, of families, water, shelter, and health. So we're going to tell your stories every day until issues transform and our communities transform with them.
Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week, or I guess we're his guest, is artist Kent Monkman. We're with him here in his Toronto studio. And Kent, we were talking about shame and prejudice, and there's 9 different sections. Maybe you can tell us why you chose those sections.
Well, I wanted to begin this story 150 years before Confederation. Canadians are celebrating 150 years of Canada, so it really begins with the Confederation. So I wanted to go back to 150 years, because for Indigenous people who've been here for thousands and thousands of years, essentially forever, 150 years doesn't mean anything. But I begin this story in the period of New France. So I wanted to go back to that period because this was a time that where Indigenous people were kind of players in this the development of the first economy of North America, the fur trade, and this is before the signing of the treaties and before all of these colonial policies really started to dispossess Indigenous people of their land. So the story begins there, and then it transitions through the signing of the treaties. The deliberate starvation of the Plains Indian people, the decimation of the bison, the beginning of the Indian Act, the residential school system, and then all the way up into contemporary times. So I really wanted to kind of, it just sort of naturally broke into these 9 chapters. I traveled across the country for a year and looked into museum collections and found a lot of objects and things that I wanted to borrow. These objects actually also inspired the creation of some of the work. And so the exhibition is not just an exhibition of my work, it's also an exhibition of a number of different museum objects that I chose and have curated them to show with my own works.
What does Canada 150 mean for you?
Well, with this exhibition, this is my statement about Canada 150. I really want Canadians to think about when they celebrate Canada 150, that they're really thinking about what it has meant for Indigenous people. And so this exhibition is really my statement about that.
As we mentioned, we're here in your studio, and some people might think of an artist painting by himself in a room. You have a number of people here. What's the process?
Well, I realized about 11, 12 years ago that it was impossible for me to kind of do everything myself, just because there was more demand for my work, and I was getting kind of overwhelmed with administrating my practice and emails and going to the art store. So I started to work with assistants, and over the years it's grown. I work with about 6 different people here now, and they all have different roles. I have a studio manager, and I have painters and a sculptor, and I've trained the painters. We work together on the paintings, and they help me build the painting from the ground up. And this is very much a sort of Western classical model of the artist in his atelier that I'm sort of reproducing here. And it's really an effective way of creating more work, but also creating better work. And there's a real value to collaborating and to collaboration. And I collaborate, with these artists, and we end up making better work.
Some of your recent work focuses on inner city and of Winnipeg in particular. Can you tell us about some of those paintings and what's going on there?
For sure. Well, for a number of years I was really focused on the North American landscape tradition, and that was because I was looking at artists like Paul Kane and Albert Bierstadt and George Catlin, they were settler artists, but they were looking at the North American landscape. Now, the cities that have popped up all over North America, those were all Indigenous lands. Those were all places that Indigenous people gathered or, traded or met. And so I wanted to create a series with the backdrop being the urban setting, specifically the north end of Winnipeg, because I want people to remember that these are all places that Indigenous people inhabited. And this period of modernity, the last 150 years, has really encouraged people, society, Canadian society, North American society, to forget that this is Indigenous land. And so for me, it was about talking about a lot of different issues. Why are Indigenous people living, like an underclass in a city like Winnipeg? These are the first people, yet they live in conditions that they're worse than most Canadians. Why are there so many teen suicides? Why are so many of our people incarcerated. And you know, we've been institutionalized on many levels. So these are the things that I wanted to bring into discussion in these urban settings. And also, you know, that Indigenous people, we live in cities. That doesn't mean we don't exist. In fact, you know, the Indigenous culture and spirituality is very much alive, even if it's in an urban environment. You know, more Indigenous people live in cities now than they do on reserves. So that was another important part of really situating these narratives in an urban environment.
Kent, I'm hoping we can talk about Mischeif, and maybe you can tell us who Mischeif is.
So Mischeif Eagle Testicle is my alter ego. I created her because I wanted an artistic persona that could kind of live in the 19th century like the artist that I was challenging. And I wanted an empowered artistic persona that could reverse the gaze and turn her lens, her gaze on the European male. And it was a way to challenge the subjectivity of their work, to find problems with it. But I also wanted a character that could be, that could talk about, you know, Indigenous sexuality, to talk about gender, to talk about the fact that Indigenous people had two-spirit people that were between male and female. There was a third gender that existed, you know, before the Europeans came. So she's very much this empowered persona that puts forward a very empowered form of sexuality, and her gender is you know, between male and female. And so she's been just very useful to kind of go back into art history and to talk about so many different things.
She's part of the performance art. Can you tell us a little bit about the performance art that you do?
So she emerged first in my paintings, and then I realized I'd created this character, and I had the opportunity to bring her to life as a living performer. And that was kind of a turning point for me too, artistically and creatively, because I'd never really considered myself to be a performer, or, you know, maybe I was, you know, a closet performer, that I finally, you know, released this performance character. So it was really an interesting shift in my own practice, but it really, performance really speaks to an audience differently than a painting does or an installation. You know, those things are kind of inert. But whereas a performer is something that it kind of forces people to respond and deal with the piece differently. And then I make films too, so she's become she's a central character in these films and videos that I make. So there's been a real evolution to her backstory. You know, I've kind of created a backstory for her where she kind of lives in the 19th century, and she time travels, she's in the present, and she has otherworldly qualities about her. She can be a trickster at times. So it's just a really fun and layered way of you know, interacting with art history and some of the different themes that I want to talk about.
What's been the reaction to Mischeif?
Well, largely, I think people really respond to her because she's a little bit dangerous, she's a little bit damaged, she's real, and she's fun, she's got, you know, she's the narrating voice in the Shame and Prejudice exhibition, so she really is central to that exhibition, is that she takes the audience on this journey, and she's really speaking about her community, which is, you know, Indigenous North America. So I found that, you know, people have connected with her as a character.
Kent, we've got to take a quick break. We'll be back with more of Kent Monkman here on Face to Face.
If a story is uncomfortable, would you change it? No, you wouldn't, because there's no power in holding back. Stories have the power to change lives, so true storytellers uncover every side of hunger, of families, water, shelter, and health. So we're going to tell your stories every day until issues transform and our communities transform with them.
Welcome back to Face to Face. We are the guest this week of Kent Monkman in his Toronto studio. And Kent, we've spoken a little bit about or touched on youth at times throughout this interview, and I'm just wondering, you know, what you would say to youth for those looking to get into art. There's a lot of artists out there, and you know, some inspiration for them.
Well, I think the most important thing is to get trained. Get trained, learn, improve your skills. You have to, there's lots to learn, and stay true to your vision too, and be open and be curious and try and learn as much as you can about the kind of work that you want to make. Whether you're a painter, get some training. If you want to be a filmmaker, go to film school. I mean, it's as simple as that in terms of getting the basic skills. And once you have the basic skills, then you can pretty much do what you need to do to express yourself.
So, Kent, we think of people who do paintings or any kind of work, art, that it's just one medium. You work in many mediums, and if, is that difficult for you, or do you find it freeing to be able to do that?
I actually find it really liberating to be able to work in a few different mediums, because some of your ideas might be better suited, in one over the other. So another reason why I wanted to kind of explore other mediums other than painting is painting can be a very solitary pursuit. At least it was in the early part of my career, and I was drawn towards other Indigenous artists. I wanted to collaborate with other Indigenous artists. And so some of my early explorations in film and video and installation came through collaborating with Indigenous artists like Michael Greyeyes and Native Earth Performing Arts. I actually designed some theater, some plays for Native Earth in the early part of my career. So I enjoyed the collaborative aspect of that. But then certain ideas just work better as a film or as a video, and so I really like the fluidity of being able to, go back and forth between the different mediums, and it's a lot of fun. It keeps things kind of, exciting and entertaining, and it's never boring here.
We've spoken a lot about Canada 150, and it's coming up soon. And what do you hope that people keep in mind as they're out there celebrating this? Because the country's obviously throwing a massive celebration here. What are you hoping that Canadians keep in mind while they celebrate this 150?
Well, I hope Canadians educate themselves more about Indigenous people, and to be open-minded, to learn more about the Indigenous populations that were here before them. To read the TRC, there's a starting point. There's information there now, and I feel like Canadians, there's their opportunity to learn, to educate, and to make some steps towards reconciliation, which has to come from Canadians, not from Indigenous people.
Kent, it's been a real pleasure for you to have us here in your studio and to have you here on Face to Face, and we thank you for your work and thank you for your time. Fortunately, we're out of time, but we're always looking for new guests. So if you have any suggestions, please email us at news@aptn.ca. Thank you very much for tuning in to Face. I'm Dennis Ward.